All right, picking up for APUSH video 2 for Wednesday, April 29th, the end of Hoover, beginning of FDR. News of the Army attack on the bonus Army killed any chance of Hoover had for re-election, probably because he had taken the heat for MacArthur's actions. Nonetheless, by summer of 1932, he had already secured the Republican nomination. He ran a campaign stressing his traditional conservative values. His main concession was to accept the repeal of Prohibition. Hoover had opposed repeal during his first term. His opponent, New York Governor Franklin Roosevelt, argued for a more interventionist government. Roosevelt also promised relief payments to the unemployed, which Hoover had opposed throughout his term. Roosevelt won the election easily. New Deal. In his inaugural address, Roosevelt declared war on the Depression. He asked the country to grant him the same broad powers that presidents exercised during wars against foreign nations. He also tried to rally the public's confidence. In the most famous line of his speech, Roosevelt declared, "The only thing we have to fear is fear itself, nameless, unreasoning, unjustified fear." Both the powerful presidency and the people's confidence in Roosevelt played a large part in the implementation of his sweeping reforms called the New Deal. The first New Deal. Early in 1933, Roosevelt summoned an emergency session of Congress to work out the details of his recovery plan. The period that followed is often called the first 100 days because, number one, that's how long it lasted, and two, it was during this time the government implemented most of the major programs associated with the New Deal. Second New Deal started 2 years later. Roosevelt first sought to reestablish America's confidence in its banking system. The Emergency Banking Relief Act put poorly managed banks under the control of the Treasury Department and granted government licenses to those that were solvent. In the first of many fireside chats broadcast over the radio, Roosevelt reassured the public that the banks were once again secure. More than 16 million Americans listened, and they obviously took Roosevelt at his word. The following week, millions redeposited the savings they had withdrawn during the bank failures of the previous years. American banks, once on the verge of ruin, were again healthy and could begin to contribute to the economic recovery. Later, during the first 100 days, the government passed the Banking Act of 1933, which created the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, the FDIC, to guarantee bank deposits, which was a big deal since people used to lose all their money in their accounts if the bank went bankrupt. Roosevelt also instituted a number of intentionally inflationary measures in order to artificially raise prices to get more money flowing into the economy. Roosevelt then set out to provide relief for the rural poor. At the time, farmers were overproducing. They hoped that by growing more, they can make up for falling produce prices. But their efforts were futile. The more they produced, the further prices fell, just as they had in 1800s from the time of populace. Roosevelt's solution was the Agricultural Adjustment Act, referred to as the AAA. So many of Roosevelt's new agencies were referred to as their acronyms, often called alphabet soup or alphabet agencies. AAA provided payments to farmers in return for their agreement to cut production by up to one-half. The money to cover this program came from increased taxes on meat packers, millers, and other food processors. A month later, Congress passed the Farm Credit Act, which provided loans to those farmers in danger of foreclosure. Several other New Deal programs established government control over industry. The NIRA, the National Industrial Recovery Act, consolidated businesses and coordinated their activities with the aim of eliminating overproduction and by doing so stabilizing prices. The NIRA also established the Public Works Administration, the PWA, which set aside $3 billion to create jobs, building roads, sewers, public housing units, and other civic necessities. At the same time, the Civilian Conservation Corps, CCC, provided grants to states to manage their own PWA-like projects. In one of the New Deal's most daring moves, the government took over the Tennessee Valley Authority. Under government control, the TVA, which provided energy to the Tennessee Valley region, expanded its operations greatly, which led to the economic recovery of the region. In June 1933, Congress adjourned. In the first 100 days, most of the programs that had made up the first New Deal were in place, although others, such as the creation of the National Labor Relations Board, NLRB, which mediated labor disputes, and the Securities Exchange Commission, SEC, which regulated the stock market, were not implemented until 1934. The first New Deal was an immediate success, both politically and economically. The unemployment rate fell and wages rose. In the midterm elections of 1934, Democrats increased their majorities in both houses. There's a sidebar on Keynesian economics. Roosevelt's response to the Great Depression was guided by the work of economist John Maynard Keynes from Britain. Keynes contended that depressions were the result of a vicious cycle in which the people see that the economy is bad, so they fear that money will be hard to come by, so they don't spend the money they have, so businesses fail, so the economy worsens. People fear the money will be hard to come by, and so on. The solution, Keynes argued, was for the government to step in and embark on a program of deliberate deficit spending as a multiplier effect, would ensure that every dollar spent would do several dollars worth of good in reviving the economy. If the people who needed money the most received a little extra, they would spend that money immediately on things they needed. That money would go to businesses who could afford to hire more people, who would start receiving paychecks and then spend the money, which would go to businesses who could afford to hire more people, and so on. The success of Keynesian economics during the Roosevelt administration, especially as an embodied in the United States deficit spending in World War II, led to the widespread acceptance of Keynes' theory, which resulted in nearly 30 years of economic expansion from 1945 to 1973. Okay, I'm going to stop that reading there. We're going to go ahead and look at the key concepts from, let's see, key concepts from the course guidebook, Unit 7. Too far. Let's see. So yesterday we actually didn't cover World War I's key concepts. All right. After initial neutrality in World War I, the nation entered the conflict departing from the U.S. foreign policy tradition of non-involvement in European affairs, in response to Woodrow Wilson's call for the defense of humanitarian democratic principles. Although the American expeditionary forces played a relatively limited role in combat, the United States' entry helped to tip the balance of the conflict in favor of the Allies. Despite Wilson's deep involvement in post-war negotiations, the U.S. Senate refused to ratify the Treaty of Versailles or the League of Nations. Home front. Official restrictions on freedom of speech grew during World War I as increased anxiety about radicalism led to the Red Scare and attacks on labor activism and immigrant culture. Immigration from Europe reached its peak in the years before World War I. During World War I, nativist campaigns against some ethnic groups led to the passage of quotas that restricted immigration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, and increased barriers to Asian immigration. The increased demand for war production and labor during World War I led many Americans to migrate to urban centers in search of economic opportunities. In the Great Migration during and after World War I, African Americans escaped segregation, racial violence, and limited economic opportunity in the South, moved to the North and West, where they found new opportunities but still encountered discrimination. In the 20s, new technologies and manufacturing techniques helped focus the U.S. economy on the production of consumer goods, contributing to the improved standards of living, greater personal mobility, and better communication systems. New forms of mass media, such as radio and cinema, contributed to the spread of national culture as well as greater awareness of regional cultures. Some more cultural 20 stuff. By 1920, a majority of the U.S. population lived in urban centers, which offered new economic opportunities for women and international migrants and internal migrants. After World War I, campaigns against some ethnic groups led to the passage of the quotas that restricted immigration, particularly from Southern and Eastern Europe, and increased barriers to Asian immigration. Migration gave rise to new forms of art and literature that express ethnic and regional identities, such as the Harlem Renaissance. In the 20s, cultural and political controversies emerged as Americans debated gender roles, modernism, science, religion, and issues related to race and immigration. All right, Great Depression. The United States continued its transition from a rural agricultural economy to an urban industrial economy, but led by large companies. Episodes of credit and market instability in the early 20th century, in particular the Great Depression, led to calls for a stronger financial regulatory system. During the 1930s, policymakers responded to the mass unemployment and social upheavals of the Great Depression by transforming the U.S. into a limited welfare state, redefining the goals and ideas of modern American liberalism. And I'll save 7.10 for tomorrow when we cover the rest of the Great Depression and then go into World War II.